Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Welcome to today's webinar, Toward Holistic Landscape Conservation in the 21st Century. My name is Tanya Navolka. I'm the Program Manager for the International Land Conservation Network at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I'm very glad to be hosting this session. Moderating the talk today will be Jim Levitt, Director of the International Land Conservation Network, whose video you should be able to see at the top right corner of your screen. Before I hand it over to Jim to introduce our speaker today, let me quickly go over a few items about this presentation and the webinar platform. First, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation, so if you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it to us by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it immediately, you can hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen and it should come up. You can type in your question and send it to us, and we'll notify you if we plan to answer it live. We'll be answering questions submitted through the Q&A at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your presentation, or sorry, to your question during today's webinar, we will do our best to follow up afterward. So if we aren't in touch with you, just reach out to us if you have a question, and we'll communicate with you in other manners. Next, you may see in your controls a chat and raise hand option. Please only use the chat and raise hand option to let us know if you're having technological issues or issues with the webinar platform. And lastly, today's webinar will be recorded in the cloud. The recording will be available at the International Land Conservation Network's website, www.landconservationnetwork.org, on our resources page if you or your colleagues should wish to reference it in the future. So with that, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our moderator today, Jim Levitt. Jim, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am sitting in rainy, cold Belmont, Massachusetts in my home office, and I'm about to talk with our friend Michael Whitfield, who reports that where he is in Idaho, it's in the high 20s, it's clear, and he's got 2 feet of snow in his backyard. So we're a little jealous that you're having a good old-fashioned winter, Michael, and we're very glad to have you here with us today. Michael is the recipient of the 2018 Kingsbury Browne Fellowship, and he received the Kingsbury Browne Award from the Land Trust Alliance at the 2018 rally. His fellowship gives Michael the opportunity to do some writing for the land protection community that he hopes, and I think he's fulfilled that hope, will be a permanent contribution to the literature in the land trust community and allow us to keep growing not only in the United States, but all over the world. We have today an international audience. There are more than 80 people in this virtual room right now, and we're glad to have all of you. I think that the number may grow just a little bit even from there. Michael is a conservation biologist and research associate, as you can see on your screen, with the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. He is a founder of a founding member of the Heart of the Rockies Initiative, and he founded within that initiative the High Divide Collaborative, which will be the subject of part of his talk today. If you want to get a more in-depth view of Michael's thoughts on the subject of toward holistic landscape conservation, you can Google the phrase Michael Whitfield, holistic landscape conservation, and you'll see a link to his working paper, which is on the Lincoln Institute website, as it's also on the ILCN website at present. I have known Michael for more than 15 years, and I have always greatly admired his work and his what he stands for as an individual. He's got tremendous integrity. He cares deeply about his work, and we are delighted to have him to share with all of you today. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you much, Jim. I appreciate that introduction, and thanks to the Lincoln folks for hosting this presentation. Jim Levitt was the convener for the first nationwide discussion of landscape conservation a number of years ago, and I greatly appreciate his leadership on this topic, so thank you. And thanks to all of you for sharing your time today. I know it's a difficult time, so above all, I wish you health and peace in this time. I've given a lot of talks over my 50-year career in conservation, but today I'd like to take a different tack. My experience is coupled with the global environmental and social crisis that we now face convinces me that we need a broader, more holistic approach to conservation if we are to conserve the wild nature that's been my life's passion. Today, I hope to make the case for that holistic approach. I ask that we as conservation practitioners recognize the need to think and act with broader perspectives than we have in the past. Like many of you, I've had many wonderful opportunities to study wild nature and many opportunities to share in partnership efforts to advance conservation. However, I've often lived the errors of an incomplete perspective. I've helped develop policy and write conservation plans that never made it to the ground. I participated in so-called collaborations that included only state and federal agencies and left out many stakeholders. I've won conservation advocacy campaigns that alienated potential partners and led to temporary solutions. I've advanced science that informed symposia that failed to reach conservation practitioners, and I've shared ideas with like-minded people while missing opportunities to speak with a broader community. I've formulated goals that might have met current needs but failed to recognize the challenges of the future. As a result, I've at times been defensive, territorial of my perceived turf, even self-righteous. Of course, those attitudes don't solve problems. I've gradually learned the value of a more holistic approach that includes the interests of people and nature with an intentional focus on durable and measurable outcomes that benefit the future well-being of people, animals, and nature. So what should our conservation goal be? A wildlife species, ecosystem targeted, something larger? Today, I hope to make a case for holistic conservation at the landscape scale. I believe that to be successful in the long term, we need a holistic vision with both ecological and social goals, a landscape scale conservation approach with conservation practitioners who are skilled in community engagement and collaboration, and with an explicit seat at the table for the common future of nature and humanity. I'm an irreverent, a-religious biologist, and I claim no expertise in the social realm. I'm not asking anyone to add a social science degree to their resume. But with this presentation, I merely wish to point to the connection between environmental conservation and social justice, and to argue that we cannot achieve just preservation of nature or society without simultaneous attention to both. Further, we need more voices in our conservation conversation if we are to be relevant. And with concurrent consideration of natural and social concerns being a daunting challenge, it is of itself insufficient. We are in the midst of an ongoing human-induced mass extinction that threatens all life on Earth, human and non-human. As current conservation practitioners, we must intentionally consider the interests of future generations of human and non-human beings. As we preserve the nature around us, we revitalize our humanity. So I'd like to talk a bit about building a case for what I'm terming holistic landscape conservation. And I'll start out with some conservation targets, both ecological and social. And you can see the list here: biodiversity, connectivity, resilience, functional ecological processes, social processes, and social well-being. With regard to biodiversity, we need to sustain biodiversity at multiple levels, multiple scales: genetic, species, and ecosystem. Protection of large, intact areas connects and sustains diverse habitat types and maintains ecological function and resilience in the context of environmental stressors like development and climate change. We need ecosystem diversity across a variety of geographic scales. Networks of large undisturbed habitat, connectivity habitats, and smaller habitats are necessary to ensure resilience in the interactions among species and the ecological processes that support high integrity systems. Biodiversity supports both natural and human systems. Connectivity. Conservation of a permeable landscape with ecological connectivity across aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems includes provision for all these factors: species movement, genetic connectivity, migration, dispersal, life history, and biophysical processes. Landscape connectivity occurs at many scales, from the very local in your backyard to beyond continental. To maintain desired connectivity, we need to understand the current level of landscape permeability, identify existing linkage corridors, and anticipate how those might shift in condition or in position with climate change and other stressors. Maintaining and restoring connectivity can help nature and humanity adapt to climate change. Resilience. Disturbance regimes are shifting in time and space due to climate change. Risk assessments can help identify future conditions and the potential for extreme events, identify vulnerable areas, and focus management efforts on areas with the greatest ecological and social contribution to the landscape. Maintaining ecological and social processes within a range of variability of disturbance can facilitate climate adaptation. Ecological processes relate to the structural and functional components of an ecosystem: the vegetation, the water, the soil, the atmosphere, the biota, and how they interact with each other within and across ecosystems. The four fundamental ecosystem processes, or ecological processes of ecosystems, are the water cycle, the biogeochemical or nutrient cycle, energy flow, and community dynamics, or how the composition and nature of an ecosystem changes following a disturbance. As biologists and conservation practitioners, we're learning to think of ecological conservation in a systems kind of way. But can we really achieve lasting conservation results if we're not also thinking about human communities and social needs? As we consider the big picture, I believe that our conservation efforts must be fundamentally grounded both in appreciation for the needs of wild nature and natural systems, and in respect for the individual dignity of people in all sectors. We achieve our conservation goals through our work in human society, and herein lies a huge current challenge. Society is held together by the consensus of its members and cannot maintain stability, order, and progress without some level of civil discourse, order, and progress. Change rises when people think and act against conditions that are not favorable to their well-being. Tools and processes that allow us to resolve conflict and better conditions for all our people are crucial. We need diversity in interests, skills, and perspectives, and effective communication systems to provide the means to formulate and achieve societal goals. Today, we face many unprecedented challenges, ecological and social. These challenges result from human overpopulation and resource use, coupled with the confounding impacts of habitat fragmentation and the existential threats that arise from a rapidly changing climate. The current human population worldwide is 7.3 billion, and clearly it's stressing the planet. But by 2100, that population is expected to reach 10.9 billion. The resulting ecological challenges are manifold, and I've listed some of those here. And I want to dig a little bit into some of these. Loss of biodiversity. If we think of birds as indicators of the health of natural systems, the canaries in the coal mine, we're in trouble. Solid science tells us that we've lost 30% of total bird numbers in North America over the last 50 years. Globally, human impacts have created a current extinction rate for all natural species that is between 100 and 1,000 times greater than what it was before 1800. Habitat loss poses the greatest threat, and all of the world's habitats are continuing to disappear. This leads to reduced biodiversity, which means millions of people face a future where food supplies are more vulnerable to pests and disease, and where fresh water is in irregular or short supply. Biological diversity is a resource upon which we and future generations depend. Habitat fragmentation reduces habitat area and patch size, enhanced edge effects at habitat boundaries, loss of habitat complexity, and population isolation can all lead to population decline or loss, decreased species richness, and decay of ecosystem functionality. This is what habitat or ecological fragmentation looks like in my backyard. The western meadowlark, many of you are familiar with, a widely distributed species, common the state bird in 6 states. When I was about 8 years old, my granddad took me out to the edge of my hometown, Driggs, Idaho, and pointed out a bird song, the Meadowlark. He asked me, "What is that bird singing?" and said, "Teton Valley is a pretty little place." That stuck with me. According to the North American Breeding Bird Survey, Western meadowlark breeding populations have declined over 1% per year between 1966 and 2015, resulting in a cumulative decline of 48%. That hits me hard. There are half as many meadowlarks as there were when I was a boy. And for those of you in the East, the eastern meadowlark is in an even steeper decline. Again, a common species, but an estimated 89% loss over those same 50 years. The big threat for both of these common species, habitat fragmentation, loss of grasslands. Of course, climate change is today's big challenge. Climate change is impacting all our valuable ecosystems, and the human economies and communities that depend on plants and animals and habitats. We're seeing the impacts across the country: drought and threats of water scarcity, or changes in mountain snowpacks that are essential natural water reservoirs, more severe storms, flooding, wildfire, more rapid spread of invasive species and disease. Climate change is a global existential threat to nature and humanity that can only be mitigated by global policy and action, but isn't everything. Global begins with local. We all have to be a part of dealing with the root causes. We also must deploy our best strategies of climate mitigation in all our conservation efforts. The U.S. Census Bureau estimated in 2017 that nearly 40 million Americans live in poverty, according to official measures. While poverty disproportionately affects marginalized communities, there are people who live in challenging economic conditions in all our country's geographies. And in a time like this current disease pandemic, these are the people who are even more vulnerable. Poverty limits access to education, limits awareness of opportunity. The prevalent myth is that jobs are the silver bullet to defeat poverty, but they need to be jobs that are well-paying enough to support a family and provide for a future. Across our country, over 550,000 Americans are homeless. Across the nation, escalating home prices and a tight rental market have strained the affordable housing supply in many areas. At last measure, 18.2 million American families spent more than 50% of their income on rent. Affordable housing is not just a problem in fast-growing cities, but also in rural areas like my own. Here in Teton Valley, Idaho, a very rural area, many of the people that work here have to commute from the lower valley because of the high cost of rent here. As a result, I'm hearing challenges to the legacy of private land protection that's been my life's work for the past 30 years. The question being, is conservation limiting housing opportunity? I don't think that this is a valid either-or proposition. We need both, but this is a discussion in which we need to engage. With regard to food insecurity, nearly 40 million people struggle with some level of hunger in the United States. A household that is food insecure has limited or uncertain access to enough food to support a healthy life. Children are more likely to face food insecurity than any other group in our country. In 2017, an estimated 15 million households were food insecure. Minority and low-income neighborhoods and communities in transition are disproportionately targeted by industries that follow the path of least resistance when deciding where to locate hazardous waste sites and other polluting facilities. And this is an issue across the country. I'd say simply that just conservation means provision of clean air and water and green space for all our people. So I want to talk a bit about conservation approaches that are used on both the ecological and environmental justice fronts. And I'm just going to blow through these pretty quickly, but these are tools that we can apply. Ecological hotspots. This is a focus on regions with relatively high levels of biodiversity. Of course, the risk is to neglect areas with relatively low species richness, but which have other types of conservation value. Science policy partnerships, usually an interdisciplinary approach, might be focused on things like vulnerability and irreplaceability. The challenge is to engage all the stakeholders. Broad-scale modeling. Modeling efforts are teaching us a lot about the landscapes. They help us identify conservation priorities in a changing climate at broad scales. You've heard of models like permeability and resiliency, circuit theory. But as all modelers tell us, models are helpful, but all models are wrong. we need the reality check we gain from diverse stakeholders. Perhaps our most renowned ecologist on the planet today, E.O. Wilson, has proposed a dramatic solution: dedicate fully half the surface of Earth to nature. Of course, the challenge with this approach is how to accommodate the people who live in nature's half. And finally, landscape scale collaborations. There are landscape conservation initiatives, small and large, rural and urban, all across the country, in all regions of the country. On the social side, the approach has usually been advocacy campaigns and litigation. Of course, this is a strategy employed by advocates, often based on violation of civil rights laws. There are education campaigns. There are government programs in pretty much every state, executive orders to require environmental justice, and then efforts for minority communities. But these also can be a part of landscape scale collaborations. So my focus today is around the landscape conservation approach. Landscape conservation is about bridging divisions, using all the tools, all these approaches, in a more holistic conversation. And I'd ask you to remember, just as fragmented landscapes do not sustain nature, fragmented thinking does not address systematic challenges to nature and humanity. This approach requires an evolutionary step forward on 3 levels. First, a shift in geographic scale. Decades of research underscore the importance of habitat connectivity across scales. To sustain ecological and social values, conservation has to transcend boundaries and move beyond a parcel by parcel approach to the scale at which nature and society function. It requires a shift in perspective that the entire landscape, private to public, developed to wild, should be considered together in a thoughtful and integrated manner when planning conservation action. Again, an approach grounded in both appreciation for the needs of wild nature and in respect for the individual dignity of people. It requires a shift in process. Landscape conservation crosses jurisdictional and topical boundaries to transcend traditional decision-making processes and organizational structures. In short, landscape conservation is about building a collective conversation and concomitant action on how we wish to shape our relationship with the land we live on. That is vital for our sustenance. I'm going to next go to 2 examples of landscape scale collaborative conservation. I'd point out that both of these are works in progress. Neither has reached its full potential. Both have much work to do, but they're examples of bringing together diverse interests to consider broad conservation values and community needs. The first is a rural example, the High Divide Collaborative in a very rural, very conservative area of Idaho and Montana. The High Divide is often referred to as the land in between, the link between 3 of the West's iconic landscapes: Greater Yellowstone, the vast central Idaho wilderness, and the crown of the continent. It straddles the continental divide along the Idaho-Montana border, harboring the headwaters of the Missouri and the Columbia that flow to opposite oceans. It's a stronghold for wildlife species that have disappeared from much of their historic range, and a centerpiece for really wide-scale wildlife connectivity between these large ecosystems. Socially, it is a rural landscape where ranching is a cultural foundation and recreation is a growing economic driver. The High Divide Collaborative is a partnership of landowners, local community leaders, public land managers, state wildlife agencies, scientists, conservation groups, really all sectors, delivering a broad conservation for the vision that includes the conservation and restoration of public and private lands. From the outset, the collaborative has been careful to listen to all stakeholders to provide recurrent opportunities for all perspectives to be heard. Early on, participants agreed to basic standards for participation. Decisions are made by consensus. Not everyone has to be enthusiastic about a choice, but everyone has a voice. At the beginning of each meeting, the group reiterates the value of its foundation and trust in one another and the importance of respecting each other's perspectives and being responsive to each other's needs. Early on in the High Divide Collaborative, the members learned that they needed to find ways to tell their story, to really instill ownership of a landscape. The High Divide is a landscape that's beyond the perspective, perhaps, of the individual communities of which it's composed. They work to meld that together. They branded their landscape with the storytelling that's recognized resources and community values, and also through a film. The High Divide Collaborative deploys landscape conservation design practices to ensure a partner-driven approach that responds to stakeholder values and the best available science to display trade-offs toward development of a vision for a sustainable, resilient landscape. This deep and ongoing engagement with stakeholders takes time. It can be incremental at times, but it progresses. The planning process is coupled with stakeholder engagement, and it reveals resource conflicts early on. As a result, the design process is adaptive and dynamic as the group collectively develops and implements conservation strategies. The collaborative identifies and shares ecological, cultural, and social information at multiple scales to inform stakeholders about their resources and where to focus their conservation efforts. Here you can see a couple of examples, and there are many. These are maps of a modeled connectivity linkage corridors for bear movements, and another that models past and expected residential development. It points out the issues where the trade-offs are going to be. It's important to note here that the science informs stakeholder decisions, but does not make the decisions. The stakeholders make the decisions. The High Divide Collaborative partners have worked together to develop a common ground vision for the ecological and social well-being of their region, of their landscape. And they developed a number of goals that I'm showing here. Continental scaled connectivity, working family ranch lands, nationally important dispersed recreation, the cultural legacy of tribal lands and traditional uses, headwaters for world-class fisheries, the sagebrush ecosystems for their many values, the forested ecosystems for their ecological and cultural values, and habitat protected in the outskirts of towns, the wildland-urban interface, where there needs to be work to limit wildfire risks and minimize fire management costs and maintain forest management options. In the High Divide Collaborative, the partners are collaborating across boundaries, getting out of their silos, collaborating across state lines, across administrative boundaries, across agencies and across agency units, across sectors, among communities, shared values across the landscape that they can all call home. The High Divide Collaborative's area of interest is determined by the stakeholders that are engaged in the partnership. They intentionally focus not on either or conservation, but on goals that benefit both ecological and social interests. The inset at the bottom right of this is Senator Steve Daines. When he was first elected back in 2014, he was a pretty vocal opponent of some of the big conservation tools like the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But he's listened to a lot of his constituents, like those in the High Divide Collaborative and elsewhere in Montana, and has become a champion of LWCS. So it has an impact. Collaborative's demonstration of broad and deep support for shared conservation goals has yielded strong support for from local and national political leaders and congressional delegations from both Idaho and Montana. And that's resulted in substantial federal and private investments in priority land conservation. More recently, in partnership with the USDA Rural Development in Montana, the High Divide Collaborative is implementing a new program to support rural development and support the communities that are facing changes in land use, in wildlife populations, and weather and economic stability. This is a bridge to fill gaps in the ecological, economic, and social needs. There were two recent independent research projects that have measured the ecological conservation outcomes for this work and documented clearly the value of a collaborative approach to achieve conservation goals. A second example is a landscape scale collaboration in a more urban setting, the work of the Western Reserve Land Conservancy in Northeast Ohio. WRLC resulted from a merger of 13 smaller organizations to create a dynamic organization that covers an area of over 4 million acres with a population of approximately 4 million people. The Conservancy service region includes hundreds of miles of Lake Erie shoreline and hundreds of miles of stream corridors with associated riparian areas and farmlands, wetlands, and some of the best soils in the country, and also diverse urban areas like cities like Cleveland and Akron and many smaller cities and towns. They've worked with landowners and other partners to protect and conserve over 57,000 acres of wildlife habitat, recreation, and education opportunities, including public parks and preserves and working farms. The Western Reserve Land Conservancy works to protect priority lands while also focusing on social needs, programs that foster healthy cities through county land banks, urban reforestation, and connecting urban people to nature through trails and greenways. The Conservancy is broadly collaborative with a wide array of entities to deliver on its mission. Those include municipalities, conservation districts, corporations, schools, partnership in the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership for Biodiversity, leadership of the Ohio Land Bank Association to resolve home vacancy issues and revitalize neighborhoods, membership in the Cleveland Tree Coalition with recognition that trees are vital to urban health, and active participation in the coalition of Ohio Land Trusts. In 2011, the Western Reserve Land Conservancy launched what's become its Thriving Communities program to help revitalize urban centers in its service area in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. They recognize that home value is a vital asset for working people as they work their way out of poverty. They focused on research and actions to find ways to help urban neighborhoods self-heal from the housing crisis, including inventory of vacant and distressed housing properties that were perceived as toxic to neighborhood renewal. Tools include establishment of county land banks, surveying properties to identify their status and value, securing demolition funds, providing for green space through urban land conservation, urban reforestation, and research on urban blight issues. These are but two good examples of the many, many landscape collaborations across America. And here's a long list. I've tried to list what I consider key elements of landscape conservation. It's important that we find the sweet spot in terms of landscape scale. It's a mixture of local familiarity and connection to the broader picture. It's bigger than backyard, larger than any local jurisdiction, but not so grand that it loses local relevancy. In all of this, we recognize the power of collaboration to protect the landscapes that people call home, the power of sense of place. The perspective of substantive and durable success arises when people of many backgrounds come together to create that future vision. So there's it's based in respect for diversity of perspective. It's broadly collaborative. We build social capital as we work together authentically, working from trust to build relationships. It's important to mention here that the soft skills really matter in this endeavor: communications, compromise, creativity, adaptability, flexibility, critical thinking. We build social capital, and that allows us to really create some momentum. I've also provided another long list here, the next slide. And this is recognizing that holistic landscape conservation is built upon a foundation of true collaboration. This has many elements. It's about a collective conversation, building a movement for our times, full stakeholder invitation from day one, representation for future people and nature, starting with respect, building trust, empowering the authentic voices who can tell the stories of our landscape, sharing success, focus not on who authors the success, but on who gets to share in the outcomes. And again, social capital has enduring power. Our work together builds social cohesion and momentum. We truly have a huge challenge if we're to meet the conservation challenges of our day. But in America, we've been given an incredible legacy of environmental protection, a solid foundation of hope for the future of our conservation endeavors. In my neighborhood, Yellowstone is the heart of our public lands inheritance, a vital heart still beating 147 years after it became the world's first national park. Across the country, our public lands remain among the greatest of American treasures, with 28% of the total U.S. land base in federal ownership, and many additional public parks owned by states and local governments. On the private land side, land trusts and landowner partnerships are providing a more recent additional pillar of hope, having protected over 56 million acres of land as of 2018. Whereas we face a future with huge conservation challenges, we stand on the shoulders of those who have provided a rich history of conservation success. More narrowly, on the ecological front, we can also point to incredible conservation accomplishments for iconic wildlife. These species, here you see some birds of prey that were brought back from the brink by removing DDT, or many water birds like trumpeter swans that have been brought back due to restoration efforts. However, I'd point out that we can't rest on those past accomplishments. They demonstrate that there are paths to success, but recognize where we're at. Today, we're losing 1.5 million acres of natural areas in the conterminous U.S. annually. Our farmlands in both urban and rural areas are being developed and lost production at a rate of 1.6 million acres per year. The current coronavirus pandemic is most certainly highlighting our social challenges, our gaps in care for those who are most vulnerable. And I'm not speaking of old boomers like myself, but of the many disadvantaged who already struggle with food and housing insecurity, lack of access to quality health care, and environmentally compromised neighborhoods. We couple all those challenges with continued population growth and climate change. It's clearly a time to up our game. So I'm offering all of you, my fellows in conservation, without an attempt to be comprehensive, what I consider as key recommendations for our future work. And I recommend that our first action be a concerted effort to move general public sentiment to recognize, one, that the environment governs individual and community health for all humans, and two, that all of nature is justly entitled to a shot at a future on planet Earth. I think in building a movement for our times, we need to really have a collective conversation. I challenge representatives from the full spectrum of today's conservation community, from wilderness advocates to urban advocates for environmental justice, to actually physically meet together eye to eye and plan for and implement a strategy that invites people from all sectors to engage in a profound conversation about how we wish to live today and in the future. Our great collective challenge is the general public's lack of awareness and interest in the issues that we all care about. We all fail if we fail to raise conservation's public profile. Conservation science is exploding with an abundance of new information to help us meet our challenges. We need to share that growing knowledge in forms that stakeholders can understand and use. On the policy front, at all levels of governance, we need to work collaboratively across geographic, jurisdictional, and cultural boundaries and across timescales. We work from the fringes until we succeed at bringing the collaborative discussion and work into the center of what we do as a society. In addition, we need government at all levels to secure our hard-earned legacy of environmental laws and public land protections. Of course, the true measure of our policies is implementation at the local level. Good laws, good regulations, good plans don't manage biodiversity or society. Local people do. We must engage together. On the partnership front, we need decision-making that is broadly participatory and stakeholder-driven. Working together in fully shared conversations, we can discover common ground and create visions for sustainable futures for people and for nature. Successful collaborations require strong leadership, a sustained convener, of course, funding to sustain those collaborations. We need a landscape perspective. Overall, our work should be framed within a holistic landscape vision at the scales at which nature and human communities actually function. When collaborative works at a landscape scale that stakeholders consider home, its participants can fully own the collaboration. This leads to sustainable effectiveness. Effective landscape collaborations build from the power of sense of place. And I'd point out, we need neighborhoods for all. In the landscape conservation context, we recognize that rich NIMBYs will always have more power than poor NIMBYs. On planet Earth, we all live in the same neighborhood. We need to expand the meaning of backyard. Along with the supportive public, we need to continue to innovatively grow the funding needed for our landscape conservation programs and our partnerships. And finally, we need an intentional future. True collaboration, in the sense that I speak of, means that we all have a seat at the table, and further, we all share ownership of the table. In the big picture, each one of us represents a multitude of unborn voices. We have to think about and plan for the long-term future of humanity and nature. In conclusion, I believe that we as conservationists hold the keys to environmental and social renewal. At our core, we can feel the power of local community-based conservation when we experience it in action. No one individual or organization or agency can meet all the challenges that we face, nor can these challenges be tidily classified as social or economic or environmental. When we bring diverse perspectives together around a shared interest in sustaining a place that we can all call home, we can direct that power of community for tremendous benefit to nature and community at these big regional scales. We succeed together. On a global scale and in our country, we're failing to protect the future for humans and nature. We need a revolutionary course correction in our thinking and action. This is a pretty big step, but to be clear, the reform that is needed is simply the transition from short-term to long-term thinking. If we're to achieve durable outcomes that benefit the future well-being of all people, animals, and nature, we must succeed together. Some of you out there listening to this old guy talk are the young leaders who can create and share a broader vision for your home landscape and make it reality. I ask you, please, now's the time to step up. So finally, here are resources for references for the material that I've covered in this presentation. The Network for Landscape Conservation has prepared a great progress and priorities in landscape conservation, a great booklet for your consideration, and you can get that online as well as access to my presentation here. So thank you very much. Again, I wish you all health and safety as we deal with the current crisis.
Michael, thank you so much for that. I'm not sure that I knew that my esteem for you could grow, but it has today. I thought that was very eloquent and couldn't be more timely. We now have an opportunity to get questions from many of you. We have a handful of questions lined up and about 20 minutes to a half an hour to answer some of them. So let's jump right into that section of this webinar. Michael, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask you a question that we talked about yesterday, but I want to expand on it just a little bit. Can you tell us somebody as a teacher inspired you to take on your life's work, and also if there's a book or two that particularly inspired you as you were a student to say that this is an area that you should and could make a difference in?
I can speak to many references. I referenced my granddad. I actually had two granddads that really introduced me to nature at a young age. I had a high school teacher who taught us the science in biology, but always enforced the idea that nature was more than what science could tell us, that there was magic in nature. And that's always powered me, always inspired me. And I was actually a pre-medical student when Earth Day happened and got sidetracked into conservation and recognized that was my life's work. And so there's lots of references around that time, and I can go back to Joni Mitchell and all kinds of folks that have inspired me to think about our place on the planet.
Yeah, Joni Mitchell's a good reference. I just want to let the audience know that the reason that you can see my face and not Michael's is that our internet connectivity to the part of Idaho that Michael lives in is limited at the moment, but we have him in spirit. Chani, if I could ask you to scroll back to the slide introducing Michael with his photo on it, at least we'll have that image of him there. So Michael, your first question is from a gentleman named Enoch Sonangba, I hope I pronounced your name right, who is writing from, I believe, the Central African Republic. So we really do have an international audience here. Enoch says, I'm so excited by your presentation, Mike. In a country like mine, that is the Central African Republic, poaching is always scaling up. How do we contribute to put an end to that in order to preserve the invaluable species? Also, he adds, in a country where people are cutting trees to make charcoal to provide for their family as an easy way to get income, how can we help mitigate that? Knowing that is a unique means to getting money in order to respond to basic needs. That's a very tough question. You want to try to take it on, please?
That is a tough one, and I appreciate those thoughts. Certainly, it goes back to this idea of holistic conservation and recognizing that the people that live in the incredible nature that you have in Central Africa need to have their needs met socially and economically. And so a first challenge is finding ways to do that while also conserving your wildlife and your forests. And I think it starts with talking with those folks and getting to understand them and build trust and build understanding, and then working collaboratively to find solutions that keep them on the bus and allow them to succeed, as well as conservation of nature to succeed. Huge challenge.
Huge challenge. All right, we have one now from Jim Lyons in the United States, somebody that I think both you and I know pretty well. Michael, I'm sure many of us agree on the need to view our conservation challenges at a landscapes level and to consider the need to encourage social, economic, and ecological resilience. Yet we live in a time when science is challenged, federal agencies are being dismantled, such as the BLM, and institutions that enable landscape conservation are being defunded or dismantled, such as the LCCs. To move toward the vision you describe, what advice would you provide to the next administration or the existing administration in setting priorities for funding and policy guidance to move us towards this more holistic approach towards conservation?
Great question. You'd expect from Jim Lyons, and as Jim knows, a lot of the work I was involved in, the High Divide Collaborative actually got its impetus from a program under the previous administration, where there was direction toward landscape conservation and reservation of a good chunk of the Land and Water Conservation Fund for those landscape kinds of collaboratives that dealt with conservation in the manner that I've spoken of here, with reference to the High Divide. That program was very effective, but of course has gone away. The landscape conservation collaboratives were another example of the cooperatives, were, I thought, a great example of ways to bring people from all kinds of sectors and all kinds of scales together to talk about these big issues at big regional levels. And we were just at the point where we're starting to see some real success. It took time, but we were getting there, and those programs are gone. We really need to bring those all back. This emergence of landscape scale conservation that's holistic, that brings in both ecological and social frames, is vital. And I think the current crisis that we're facing highlights that. And of course, we face one that's even deeper and broader when we think about climate. So it's imperative that we bring those programs back.
Thank you. So this one is from Pat Cody in the Washington, D.C. area. You do not seem to focus on watersheds as an organizing principle. How do watersheds fit in to your thinking on holistic landscape management?
Well, they certainly do, and I think watersheds have a big bearing, both certainly ecologically, but also culturally. And for example, when we formed the High Divide Collaborative, we spent quite a bit of time really defining what our landscape was, and it's based on watershed boundaries. It's reaching out beyond the perspective of just an individual community to those that share resource interests and cultural values, and so it kind of gets to that watershed boundary. But I think, as I said in the presentation, you have to be pretty intentional about setting a landscape boundary that stretches people to think about those connections beyond their backyard, but at the same time is relevant, that is part of what they can come to see as a sense of place. So certainly watershed boundaries played a role there.
Okay. This one from Ray Beltran. Michael, since hindsight is 2020, is there any one practice or activity that would most contribute to this holistic approach, but that you weren't able to implement because you lacked social licensing capacity or the support to do it? And think about, I'm going to leave it at there. The rest of it's a complicated sentence, but is there something that you, a practice that could have contributed to the holistic approach, but you just couldn't get your hands on it or around it to put it into play?
Well, I appreciate that question from Bry. Bry is the one who developed a lot of the science that was shown in the High Divide part of that presentation. I think one aspect that I never really fully got a handle on was more in the environmental justice side of it. And I think about, you know, the home community where I live, 20% or more of my community is Latino. Folks who are absolutely vital to our economy and our school system and the whole gamut, and yet are not integrated as they should be into our society, and are often not integrated into these kinds of conservation conversations that we have. And so, you know, we didn't reach out as well as we should to those communities. Another is Native Americans. We made some attempts. We didn't get as far as we need to, and I'm hoping that's evolving. We need everybody in the conversation, and all those perspectives add to our potential for success.
All right, from Wes Ward, who's out on your side of the United States, what do you say to those in the land trust community who say our mission is conserving land? We only have the resources to stick to that mission. Others can do the social work.
I've heard that a lot, Wes, and I've heard it from really nationally recognized voices in the wilderness movement, for example, who say, you know, we need to focus on our end of the spectrum. But I just don't think we're relevant if we speak in that fragmented fashion. I think we have to come together and recognize that we're all on this planet Earth together, and we're not going to succeed unless we do. And I pointed out to a little challenge to the conservation work I've done from people who are concerned about affordable housing. Those kinds of voices are rising, and we won't succeed otherwise. There's a big movement in the land trust community now to think about community conservation. I think that voice needs to be expanded and really bring environmental justice into the fold, and we need to be all working together. We won't succeed otherwise.
Marissa Rigi asks, how can we best start working on a collective conversation as a small regional land trust?
Land trusts have great skill at working with people, and that's one of their strengths. They work across kitchen tables and build relationships. And I think just taking that skill, that talent to a broader community, sitting down with people that you don't normally interact with, sitting down with people with different perspectives from different sectors across the board, building relationships. That's the root of it. That's where collaboration begins, in those foundational relationships that we develop that then allow us to trust one another and work together.
Michael, Marissa has a follow-up question, which is, I think, maybe part of what she's thinking about in starting this conversation, which is, what do you consider seminal readings or books for landscape conservation?
Well, I would start, I think, with go to the Network for Landscape Conservation and the material that they recently put out that I referenced at the end of my presentation. And there's references there to a number of key voices in the movement. Certainly Lincoln has a lot of those kinds of references. I'd start there.
Let me just add one to that while we're thinking about this. Is I once had the opportunity to go to Wisconsin and see the good oak, and there's an essay on the good oak by, now the name is slipping me, by a giant in conservation from the 1930s and 40s from Wisconsin, that I have read around a campfire, and that gets people talking for a long, long time. And I'm sure there are 100 people out there who know exactly what I'm talking about. Aldo Leopold, thank you, Loring Schwartz. Bingo. That essay alone standing outside around a tree, perhaps, or a tree trunk that's been cut down, really gets people thinking about community and okay, so we have a question from Renee Lemon. We have 2 or 3 more questions, Michael, and then I think we're at the end of our hour. Who is missing from the conversation about landscape scale conservation, and how do we get them to the table?
Well, I referenced the environmental justice movement, and I don't think many of those folks are in the dialogue at this point, and I think that's essential. And again, it's about going to people, meeting them where they are, learning about their needs, hearing their stories, developing a relationship. I think that's maybe the biggest gap, but every landscape is unique to its geography and its place, and they're all going to have, you know, different needs in that regard.
Okay, so I'm going to close this down with a very important question from Joanne Grant, which is, what's next for you, Michael?
Well, I'm an old guy. I'm retired from actively leading a collaborative or that sort of thing, but I'm still very engaged in my place. I'm working in wildlife research right now, but also working with communities. We face huge challenges, and I'm going to keep at it until they cart me away.
Okay, good enough. So I want to thank all of you. There, at one time or another, have been more than 100 participants on this webinar. I think it's been a treat to have Michael Whitfield with us today. And I want to alert you to the fact that starting on April 22nd, we're going to have a webinar series that is kind of the digital plan B for the ILCN conference, the International Land Conservation Network conference that we had planned to hold in Barcelona, Spain on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. We, because of the coronavirus crisis, are not able to be in Barcelona this spring. We're hoping that we'll be able to go there next spring, but a number of the panelists and speakers that were going to speak at that conference are now going to be available to all of you online through this webinar series. So we have all of your coordinates. We will make sure that we get the word out to you about this series, and we look forward to keeping this community of practice going, to keeping the conversation going, and to be ready to act for the benefit of the earth when the opportunity appears again. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Michael, for an excellent presentation, and I hope you all have a pleasant afternoon. So long.
Thank you much.